Then there'll be time left over for Q&A at the end. Some quick housekeeping items. The recording of the session will be available on the CG website, the wiki site, for archival purposes, and I'll have it available within about 5 business days. If you have trouble connecting through audio, just try dialing in. You may have a better experience that way. Everyone will be on mute. Please use the chat window to ask questions. I'll be monitoring it, and if you would include your name and your institution, so I can call that out when I start asking the questions that come in. Thank you, Chaz, for being here with us today, and for taking some time out with us. Chaz is a storyteller with a background in technology and marketing. He leads the product management team at the University of Notre Dame, serving as an advocate between the end user, technology, and administration. Prior to joining IT, Chaz worked as the director of interactive marketing and digital strategist at the university, where his work was recognized by the Webby Awards, CASE, and EduStyle. He is also the founder of Hedgehog Interactive, which designs games for professional development and training. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Chaz.
Thank you, Mitch. This is a webinar. Webinars are terrible. They're boring, and I fully expect people to be sitting in the background working while they have this on playing and half paying attention. So with that in mind, I will do my very best to try to make this at least somewhat interesting and entertaining. As you see on the slides are available. The Google Slides are available at this link, Retire Service Webinar. It's a bit.ly link. And the toolkit, which is a few pages of, which I will show you just briefly here. It's a few pages worksheet that walks through the framework and some of the tools we will use here. This was actually produced in originally as a session, a workshop for Educause Connect, which we did in Chicago in April. Very interactive. So obviously the webinar is not quite as interactive as that, but hopefully you'll get some good use out of this. And of course, I'm happy to take questions here at the end. So as Mitch mentioned, I'm Chaz. You can see that we did headshots right in that like 3-week window where I was debating whether or not to grow a beard, and then shaved it off shortly thereafter, thereby invalidating my headshot and not looking quite like me. So very awkward. I did promise that I'd try to make it entertaining. So when does a joke become a dad joke? When the punchline becomes apparent. So because this is a webinar, I can't hear whether or not you're reacting, whether you're cracking up, I assume you are, or groaning very loudly. You can do both, it's okay. So that said, the reason of this this session here is because you can probably think of a service offering. You probably, as soon as you saw the webinar, had a service offering in mind that you wanted to retire, something you would like to get rid of, something you'd like to kill, and you have not been able to do that, or you guys have tried to do that and not been successful, or you just haven't even been able to bring it up and broach the topic because, frankly, it's really hard. And if you're like most of us, you are terrible at retiring service offerings because we have organizations built around service delivery. How do we implement new services? We have project management offices and change management teams and training teams and support teams, all designed around how do we deliver better services and service offerings. And then taking them away works completely counter to all of that. It's something we're not very good at usually. We personally here at Notre Dame, we have tried to do this many times. Our campus dial-up pool, the modem pool for dial-up numbers was embarrassingly long-lived for many, many, many years after most of us were on high-speed internet at home. Dialing into campus was still a thing that I think it was down to like 20 users for several years that we just weren't able to end for whatever reason. And so going through that process is very difficult. It's not comfortable. It makes you the bad guy. I understand that, and there's, I think, a better way to do that. So to illustrate this, I will need 2 volunteers. Unfortunately, I have 2 volunteers lined up. So we have, first off, Alice and Bob. So Alice has informed me that she is planning to retire in 90 days. Is with mixed emotions that I inform you of this. Alice has been a tremendous colleague for many, many years. She's been a good friend. She's contributed so many things over her time here. She has accomplished so many different things, changed this whole organization for the better. We will all miss her tremendously. We will be working with her closely and all of you to work on the transition over the coming months to make sure that goes smoothly. So let's all wish Alice the best as she goes on to the next great adventure in her life. So round of applause for Alice, hooray. You guys are all clapping, I can tell, because it's a webinar. Bob here has also, we have some news regarding Bob. I regret to announce that in 90 days, we will be killing Bob. Yeah, he's been with us for many, many years. We used to like him, but now it's time that he go away, and we have to get rid of him. So we will, of course, notify everybody, including his friends and family, don't worry, so they can all say their goodbyes before he's gone. So good luck, Bob. So obviously, that's preposterous, but that is actually how we talk about these things, right? So why do I use this metaphor? Because the language makes a big difference. When you talk about retirement, you have a party. When you talk about end of life, you have funerals and weeping. A retirement is a sense of opportunity. It can be seen as a new adventure, it's growth, but an end of life is loss. There's, toasting to accomplishments versus having a eulogy and people crying. A retirement, you have to build up confidence it's the right decision. With an end of life, if you're going to schedule the end of a life, it becomes highly controversial any way you look at it. Either way, you have anxiety, but one of them is tempered with feelings of joy, excitement. There's positive side of that. There's a sense that this is the right thing and here's what's going to happen. The end of life, there's a whole stage of grief and anger and denial. If you've ever shut down a service or in this side, killed a service, then those emotions right there, denial, frustration, and fear, all are very familiar. And then in terms of retirement, there's a planned and scheduled sense. And end of life, you can sometimes schedule it, or sometimes it's simply just an unexpected thing when something happens. The reason this metaphor is important is because that language influences not just how people react to and feel about how we are changing things for them as the IT organization, but also the way that we work with it, right? So it's not just our end users and how they react, but it's also how we approach it. And the first part is just about making the decision. So you can't decide, you want to retire something. In order to make that decision, you have to answer certain questions. So if we were going to make a quick to-do list of what you would do before you could decide whether or not to retire, what would you do? Okay, so how much do you need to have saved? How much is it going to cost you? What's your standard of living? What kinds of things you're going to do with your life? What kind of retirement income will you have? What's the timing for that, right? I mean, a lot of times you might consider retiring when you're not in the middle of a big project or some big thing you still need to complete. What are you going to do when you're done, once you've retired? Who do you need to inform? Ultimately, can you afford to retire is a huge part of that. So you want to retire, can you actually afford to? Even if all of us wanted to retire, not all of us can afford to. I know I have a little ways to go before I can afford to retire. Now, one of your employees, by the way, you're all promoted to being managers. One of your employees informs you that she's going to retire in 90 days. So what do you need to do? Well, you heard when we talked about Alice, we talked about having a plan. We talked about a transition, informing people. So what would you need to do? You would need to figure out what are the responsibilities? How are these things going to get done? When is she going to retire? What's that transition look like? Again, it's who are you informing? So if you're going to decide to retire, who do you need to inform? Once you've made the decision to retire, now who do you need to inform? And that's a different kind of communication. A big one for us, right, is whether or not we're going to replace it outright or if we're going to reallocate, reshape that. Do you take an open position and just say, we're going to fill it with the exact same responsibilities? Sometimes the answer is yes. Other times you say, the needs have changed. This is an opportunity for us to do something different. Let's take those resources and put them towards something else. Doesn't mean we don't have to still meet those needs. It just means that we might meet them in a different way. And one of our favorites, of course, is cake and punch, the retirement party, champagne, right? It's the celebration of that. How do you, thinking about that. So there's a point where you're thinking ahead to the future. but still acknowledging the past of where we've come and why, you know, when she's retiring. So Alice is retiring, let's throw her a party. People retirement and product retirement both require the same kind of analysis, planning, communication, transition. That's why the metaphor works really well for this. As we think about that, it gets us thinking away from killing this, the negativity of ending this and shutting this thing down. And of course, the instant bracing of like, you're not taking this thing away over my dead body, right? To how do I plan for this? This is a natural process. This is something that we expect. All technology will retire. The reality is there's not a technology that we have today that we were supporting and managing 50 years ago. And I don't think there's a technology we have today that would be supporting and managing in 50 years. The lifespan is so long and the lifespan of technology is so short that those changes are just natural. I did have a faculty member who, you know, I was just meeting with some faculty recently about a service offering that we're retiring. And he was saying, well, you want us to move to this other platform. How can you guarantee me this is going to be here in 10 years? I said, absolutely not. I hope it's not, because the technology improves so much faster than that. If you're stuck 10 years in the past with your technology, it means you're missing out on all the opportunities of what's come, the innovations and those improvements. Again, it's a way of looking at it. The pain of moving versus the opportunity cost that you're spending or you're losing out on from not moving. And positioning and framing that is the difference between retirement and killing it. And so when we end of life, when we discontinue, decommission, you know, whatever the euphemism is, retirement is the framework that I want to change the model that I'm thinking in my head around to. This is a process, this is a normal, natural thing, it's a good thing, and it's expected. And so we have to plan for it and make that transition appropriately. So the first question you have to answer is, why do you want to retire this? So let's assume that you're at the point where you have something in mind, a service offering you would like to retire, and you need to make the decision about whether you can retire it, figure out how you're going to retire it, and sell and make that successful. The starting point of this is understanding why. So in that toolkit, the first thing we encounter are, what are the key drivers? Why do you want to retire this? They are going to fall into these three different categories. When Mitch mentioned that I do product management, my team of product managers, we are living at the nexus of the users, the technology, and the business side of the services that we offer from IT. And we have to advocate and represent all of those things. In this case, we have all of those different levers pulling at us and our services. So it could very well be that the decision has been made for us and it's purely external. It could be that the vendor is no longer offering support. I'm working on a project right now where we have a legacy file storage platform that the vendor is no longer going to support, where there's no commercial support we can pay for. We're not comfortable with being out of support. So that's a huge driver for us. Cost and funding. If it's just simply too costly or there are much cheaper alternatives available, the alternatives there becomes a point. Available resources. If you simply don't have the resources to manage this and the need is being pulled elsewhere. Vendor relationship. We've seen this where vendors change. There's an acquisition, there's new staff involved, the relationship sours, and it's just not a strong enough relationship to stay there. That can be a driver for why you're moving. There can be legal or contract reasons as well. You'll notice the shortest list here is the users list. I've got down customer satisfaction, the availability of alternatives, people voting with their feet, right? Usage and adoption rates. So where people are going naturally, where people want to go, if there are better features, there's other functionality that would drive you to those things. You'll start to see that from the users. The key driver being user focused is going to be your best benefit. And I'll get back to that in a second. On the technology side, we have a lot of technology reasons. This is often where I've seen us try to retire service offerings, because we try to shut it down because we don't want to manage this anymore, or because we don't have the people who know it, or because of some technical reason. And the problem with that is that our users don't understand or care. And in the case of the staffing expertise or not having the resources, our users often will look at us and say, but that's your job. And even internally, where we have situations where we'd like to retire something, and the reason we want to retire it is because I don't want to manage this thing anymore. That's not a particularly compelling reason to the user who lives and dies by this thing, where they need this to do their job. So I have a service, I rely on this on a daily basis, and you just want to stop doing it because you don't want to do it anymore. That's not going to be a successful change. You're going to be fighting against functional needs by simply saying, I don't want to do this. When the reality is, our administrative IT positions exist to support those functional needs, to deliver those services. And if we just don't want to do it, we're basically saying, I just don't want to work anymore. And so feel free to not pay me. We can shut down the service and they can do something else. Like, does that make sense? Of course not. The reason that I mentioned user-driven or user-centered rationale is that that's the thing that's going to speak to the users the most. Why do you want to change this? When we were looking at our email system about 4 years ago, we had a on-prem email system running Exchange. And what we found was people were really unhappy with this, and we were looking at alternatives. And when we made the decision to retire it, the main reasons, there were lots and lots of reasons to retire the on-prem service and move to the cloud. The main reasons were these three. Number one, people wanted more space, and we couldn't give it to them in the on-prem system. We didn't have the room or the resources to provide the space. Number two, they wanted better experience with mobile and Mac and Linux, and it was very Windows-centric. And three, they wanted to be able to calendar across faculty, students, and staff. Even though that was something that we believed very strongly they didn't want to do, it turns out they did. So those three reasons were user-focused reasons why we needed to end of life, retire, shut down the thing we had, and figure out how to get my connection back on. Sharing is paused. Resume share. Paul, am I online? All right, it's saying.
I hear you, Chris. I see you. Or Chaz, I see you too.
Okay, great. So I'm back. Thought I'd muted it all. So anyway, those three reasons were user-focused reasons, and those reasons were reiterated throughout the entire process, from the communicating to people why we were shutting this down when we first did, all the way to the point where we were making that move and delivering a new service, because that's the promise that we were making as to why we were switching. We moved to cloud email, and we ended up going to Google Apps, and that process there had to deliver on those three reasons. Otherwise, users would be calling us out on why we were shutting this thing down, because shutting this down and retiring on-prem email was going to cause them pain. And that's one of the keys to all of these things. Retiring a service offering means you're causing people pain. You're going to disrupt what they do, and you're going to be disrupting a lot of people's lives, usually in that case. And so in going through that process means you have to have solid understanding, solid rationale of what your drivers are and why you're doing it, and then communicate them thoroughly. You also have to understand, why are people using this? So there are two parts of this: getting your voice to your customer. Why are they using it? So there's a functional, what's the use, and then what's the emotional attachment, what's the feeling for this. We have many of these services. Where the reason that they are using it is not functional whatsoever. It's simply because that's what they've been doing. So there's an inertia, it's comfortable, it's something that they know very well, they're invested in, they went through the training, and so they would be losing and being, something is taken away from them. And that's scary, and you have to manage through the emotion as well as the functional side. The emotional intelligence part of a project like this is more difficult than the functional. The technology ends up being relatively easy in most of these cases. It's not usually what we think of, given that we have a huge IT department trying to deliver IT services. But the technology isn't usually the hardest part of delivering IT services. It's the people, and how they feel is important that you capture those. So we're going to start off by understanding and writing down, what are these use cases? What are they doing? And then also, what will they do once we take this away? How will they do these things? This is, to me, the biggest reason why service retirements die, because we have identified that we want to retire something, we try to take it away, and we don't have a suitable replacement on the other side. When you get down to a faculty member, your students, your administrators, whomever, trying to do their jobs and then asking the question of your boss, okay, so how am I going to do this once you take this away? If you don't have an answer to that, you're going to lose. Because again, we exist to provide the services to meet their needs, to serve the mission of the university and whatnot. So understanding what those alternatives are is critical. And how do these people feel about them? Is this a must-have? Is this a I don't want to change? Is this a nice-to-have? Is this purely resistance because of the change, or is this a technical, firm, hard requirement that you have to meet? So understanding all of those things is an important process. So in the worksheet, one of our next steps is to look through what are the use cases, what are the requirements, and then what are the alternative approaches. So in the example of a legacy file system that we're in the process of retiring, I need to store large files on the network so other people can access them. Well, we have Box, we have Google Drive, we have lots of other tools that are available already. Some of them are unlimited storage, easier sharing. That's a hard requirement. I need to be able to do these, but we have suitable replacements for the vast majority of those. Okay, so what we're finding is that maps pretty well one-to-one. We can meet that requirement. How they do it, that's a change. We're gonna have to, there's gonna be training and communication and working and managing the change, but we can meet the requirement. I need to automatically map the drive to the file space in the classroom. I log into my classroom, Podium, the computer there, and it automatically maps my network drive. So how am I gonna do that? Well, it's not going to do that. Yeah, that's a change. That's also not a hard requirement. It's simply something that is a convenience. And there are other conveniences we're gaining. As we lose that one, we will be gaining many other conveniences that should outweigh that. So here are alternatives. Here's how to easily access your content when you're in the classroom. Again, it's different, but that's not a hard requirement. It's a nice to have. I need to host files for websites. Sure, but it doesn't have to be in the same platform. So there's a different platform we have for web hosting. So we can move you over to those and split that out. So you can still meet the hard requirement of hosting web content, but it's just not going to be in this exact same place. So we've found these three main use cases. We've found alternative approaches and solutions to them, and we're going to have to communicate. Now we can build a plan around how do we train and educate people on those things. This is a bake sale. We had a colleague about 2 years ago announced she was going to retire. And I mean this in the actual retirement sense. She was opting to retire. This wasn't a Bob being retired against his will situation. So Mary was our software license administrator, really nice, really smart, been here for a very long time, and ran their software licensing program. It was an insane amount of institutional knowledge in her head. And we knew this was going to be a long-term thing. So she gave us a lot of time to plan on what we're going to do. One, we knew we needed to replace her. We couldn't reallocate that. We needed to hire somebody. We got somebody. Two, we overlapped that a ton, made sure I understood all the requirements, all the different responsibilities and the roles, and spent like a year transitioning with some overlap to make sure that the new person was up and running by the time Mary decided to start traveling and going on cruises and leave our employment. What we didn't think about, and what was really difficult, is that Mary also ran, because we're Notre Dame, we have a Catholic mission team here in our organization. We have a lot of different fundraisers, and she would run bake sales, chili cook-offs, all kinds of different events to support local nonprofits and help. It was a cultural thing. Well, Mary was doing that, but we didn't see a way that we could put software license and administrator must also bake cookies and run chili cook-offs and organize, Catholic mission fundraisers. Like, that's not a job responsibility we're going to bake in there and make it a part of somebody's formal PD, but as an important part of what Mary did for the organization. It was something we valued. I would call it an off-label use of Mary, right? This is a function she was filling, but was not actually part of her position description. So in our list of functions, sometimes we have things that are not the ones that we would draw up and say, these are the actual requirements, but people are using them this way. What are those off-label uses? And do you have alternatives for that? If they are important to you, then they should be in that list and you need to have a plan. In our case, we found another volunteer to head up the Catholic mission, but instead of trying to take on everything that Mary was doing, we started to divvy that up and delegate that out. And so my team actually just volunteered to run a month of pizza lunches and events and things like that to take on, to find a nonprofit to benefit, because that's something that is important. So all the different departments and teams are taking those things on. So that was how we solved that. Again, the off-label uses are important. One of your major roadblocks to retiring a service offering can very well be your own people internal to your organization. The people who are most likely to absolutely kill the process are the ones who have so much invested. And if we're thinking entirely on our external users, our customers on the outside, the end users and their functions, we may be neglecting some of the most important allies or enemies to this process. So who might those people be? Well, early supporters of the product. Is there an executive who put his weight behind putting this thing in place 8 years ago? And this was a huge thing for him, and he's invested in this. And is he involved in this process? So have you made him part of the decision? How about the people who created this product or implemented it, the team that was there? I spent you know, a year and a half, almost 2 years working around our move off of our on-prem email and into, you know, Google. One day we will move out of Google and into something else. At that point, how much of my investment in that back then and my career has been built up around my successes around that project, and now somebody else is trying to take that away, right? And how are they speaking to that thing? So thinking about the way that we talk about that, there are people with strong vendor relationships, and those vendor relationships can be great ways to get things done, can make us more effective and efficient. And if you're switching vendors, you're hitting the reset button on those vendor relationships. And that is another thing that you're taking away. And then one of the worst things is we have people whose entire careers have been built around building up expertise, getting certifications, and becoming the resident expert in this technology, this stack, this platform, this vendor, whatever it is. And then switching means we're taking that away. Now you're taking somebody who feels safe and secure in their job, one of our colleagues, and now you're taking all that security away by hitting reset on what they're good at, the value they provide. What does that do to their career? How are they going to feel? Now, if you need the same folks, that executive, you need that implementation team, you need those engineers, you need the vendor manager, all those folks, you need them to be part of your process to retire the thing and move on to the next one. You have to worry about how are they going to feel, what is their reaction going to be, and what are they going to do when you start to talk about this. So if you talk about this saying, hey, that system's terrible, it's awful, it's never up, we need to get rid of this thing, we need to kill that and move to the next. This thing's going to be so much better, it's going to blow that away, everybody will love that. When you're talking about that negatively of the old thing, you're starting to build up walls around the people who had been supportive of it at one point. There was a reason you put that in place. What was that reason? Why did we use that? In the tips here, making people part of the decision, working on the transition plans and thinking about those are all important. A retirement party is a great way to retire a service offering. So you can actually have cake and punch or champagne, depending on, to celebrate the retirement of this service offering. So we're getting rid of this file storage system. Well, there was a reason that we put this thing in so long ago. And there's a reason that we had it and maintained it, and it did great things for us. Let's actually build a toast. Let's give a toast to that thing, and let's recognize all the wonderful contributions that service offering and the people who made it happen had into our success. And then we can look forward to the opportunities and where we're going. Even though somebody may not be in their prime when they're retiring, doesn't mean that we go and trash them at their retirement party. We acknowledge all the wonderful things they did. We wish them well and they go forward, and then they retire and we turn and look, okay, now what are we going to do as we move forward? Again, it's trying to keep things positive, using retirement instead of end of life, keeping them positive about how we talk about this internally and externally. My slides borked here, but the point is that data is your friend when it comes to making these decisions, because so far we've talked to users and their feelings, it's qualitative, their soft skills, it's emotional intelligence. It's not something that necessarily resonates, especially with decision makers and leaders who have to bear the brunt of that. So can we back this thing up quantitatively as well? This can actually be a huge ally to you. So let's imagine the scenario, it's not too far off from the real numbers from a service that we retired, $1.3 million a year. It's a good amount of money depending on what it is. We only have 325 users. That's not a huge number of users. That comes out to $4,000 per year per user. Are we okay spending $4,000 a year per user to solve this problem? If you look at that and say, oh my gosh, no, that's ridiculous, we could do it for so much cheaper, then that's a pretty good argument that this is a candidate for retirement on the basis of cost. Other data points here would be your usage and adoption. So how are people using it? What are they doing with it? What's the take up? I have one of our service offerings, our legacy web publishing, with the tilde in the URL. We're retiring that. We've deprecated it because fewer than 1% of our new users were actually using it. Others were switching to other more modern tools. Doesn't mean there's not a core group of folks who desperately need and care about that kind of platform, but it's hard to justify that when so few people are actually taking it on. So that drives our strategy in a certain way. Benchmarking is also a great one. What are all the other schools doing? What are our peers doing? If you're the first one to make this decision, it's a different process than if you were in the middle of the pack or at the end of the pack making a move like that. So that can be very useful. It can also give you a sense of who has done this and be able to reach out to them to learn more about how they did it, what worked well for them, and so on. So now we need to take all of these inputs, the business drivers, the functional use cases we talked about, the viability of the alternatives and the voice of the customer, how they're feeling, what they're doing and how they're doing it, the quantitative side of things, and thinking about the cost of what that change might look like, and add this all up to what is your decision? How do you make that decision? So there's a tool called a force field analysis that can help with this. There are a lot of different ways. This is essentially a more complicated pros and cons list with a little bit more structure to it. So on the left side, we'll say, here are all the arguments for making this move, making this change, and here are all the arguments against on the other side, and pushing those things together. And then let's just rate each one of those 1 to 10 based on the magnitude of those changes. So is it expensive? Yeah, it's pretty expensive. Is it out of support? That's pretty compelling. That's a 9. Low adoption? Well, that's not really the driver. It's still meeting an important need. There are better options available. That's kind of in the middle there. Let's go on the other side. We have some very passionate users. That's okay. You always have some squeaky wheels, but these are particularly passionate users. We're going to call that low. But some of them are VIP users, so that's a little higher. There's a lot of technical debt, so it's hard to manage it. We don't have a lot of in-house expertise. But again, that's not a compelling reason because we can get expertise. We can train people in most cases. So when we add these things up, we see that the fours outweigh the against. Still a pretty subjective process to rate these things, but it can be useful. It's also particularly useful if you start to bring in outside folks to help rate these, right, and validate what you're looking at. So let's talk through this and bring in somebody outside who's not invested in a decision, because if you are the only one making this decision or making this analysis at this point, then you probably have made up your mind. And if you're doing this because you started with wanting to retire it, then you could be looking for confirmation of that decision. That's called confirmation bias. So we want to avoid that by bringing in some of those outside folks. So you start to get the voice of the customer and hearing how people feel. You start to bring in some of your colleagues, your internal resistors, and figuring out how they feel about it, making them part of the process. And then bringing an outsider to help you do this analysis and decision work, who can look at it more objectively and call you out when you say, hey, this is, there are much better options. And they say, really? Because it looks like they're probably pretty similar. Maybe that would temper your scores. One of the big changes, so let's imagine that you can do this before, you should be thinking about this before, you certainly need to do this right afterwards. So you're going to make a recommendation and you need to understand how are you going to make that change. So depending on what you're changing, there are lots of different paths. There are 4 main types of change paths that we identified for this. So you can look at the all at once. This is the global go live, the hard cutover. When we switched to Gmail, we did it all on June 17, 2014. That was the day everybody switched at the same time. We wanted to avoid an issue where we had people on the old calendar system and the new calendar system not being able to calendar together. That was going to be painful. We'd heard lots of horror stories from other schools that had done that. We felt it was best to minimize that, rip the Band-Aid off, and do that all at once. So it's best when compatibility is an issue or support would be untenable, where we'd be managing too many things all at once. The golden path is one that you see a lot when you introduce something and let people vote with their feet. So we're actually just this month retiring WebEx in favor of Zoom. Zoom's become a very, very popular conferencing solution in higher ed. It's the one that we're using right now. And what we had was a lot of WebEx usage, but we knew that it wasn't growing and there was dissatisfaction with the product where we had it and how we were able to deliver it. But we didn't feel like we could just take that away for a variety of reasons. So we introduced Zoom and put this out there and promoted this, and people flocked to this. In fact, 6 times as much usage of Zoom as we had with WebEx, and growing. And that happened within the first year. We get to a point where we have almost no usage of WebEx, and making that switch is very easy because people have already switched for us. The change wasn't hard. Making the decision to retire it is very easy to justify now, and a lot less work for change management. If you retired it a year ago, we'd be retiring it and training people and trying to get them to switch to Zoom. We'd be working with hundreds of users or thousands of users as opposed to a couple dozen. Adoption curve is one you see a lot with software as a service vendors. Google does this, Microsoft does this, Box, Zoom, where a lot of times what you'll see is a soft launch. We're going to put this thing in there, let people opt in to use this, and eventually we're going to force it by pushing it out on them. So you may have remembered a couple of years ago, Google Drive, Google rolled out a new Google Drive. They reworked the interface entirely, and then they popped a little button that said, try the new Google Drive. And you could decide to jump in and use the new Google Drive. You could always go back to the old one. But over time, they took away the ability to go back to the old one. And eventually they said, here's the cutoff date, we're switching now. What you do then is you cater to the folks who are early adopters. You learn your hard lessons with the early adopters, the people who are more comfortable with that risk, who are more tolerant of issues that might be happening. Those early adopters switch over, then you bring in your mainstream users, and then the folks toward the end of that curve, you have to just kind of pull them forward by making that hard switch at the end of that. So that's what we'd call an adoption curve. And the last one is the phase and segment. It's something we all probably have done many times. A lot of our projects follow this process. We're going to live in both worlds. We're going to roll it out based on your department or based on your location or based on what kind of person you are. We did this with our two-factor authentication, where we went through our staff and did it department by department so that we could train them, support them. And that's best when you can have things coexist, the situations can live at the same time, but you need to provide a lot of hands-on support, and you need to be there focusing that support on the folks who are affected. If we switched everybody at once, we would have gotten slammed with tons of calls, tons of support traffic all at the same time. So we switched them in chunks, and that worked really well. And then you can combine and mix and match these things as needed. But identifying this change can help show that you've thought through what the impact is going to be, that you can think about the way that this is actually going to roll out. And again, it's user focused. Why are we making this change? So ultimately, unless you are the CIO or the senior executive who's going to just make this call ultimately, in which case a lot of this might just simply be justifying your decision. Chances are you're going to be making this recommendation to somebody. And so making that case, bringing all of this forward is going to be all of the things that we've just talked about, right? So it's about the data, it's about the plan, the reasons, can you afford to retire it? So is this feasible? Is this optimal? Can we actually do this thing? And I'd say, do you have all of the alternate use cases? We tried to retire something a few years ago. We didn't have alternatives in place, and the result was our CIO got a bunch of angry calls, and he came back to the team saying they're asking what the alternative is, and the team didn't have an answer. And then he basically came back to the faculty and said, all right, well, we're not going to retire this until we have suitable answers. And because that was hard to do, and there were other priorities, that just fell off completely. And we stopped trying to retire it. And that was 4 or 5 years ago. And that was the third in 15 years worth of trying to retire that service offering. We have an active project now to retire it. This is called the replacement for the reckoning. This is our new project. It's just starting off. And those same resistors at the time, last time, are the ones who are most in favor of it now because they've been part of the process as we've walked through. What are the alternatives? How do we make this change? How do we make sure they're comfortable? They're still anxious, but they see the possibilities on the other side. So can you afford to retire it? If the answer is yes, should you retire it? Is this the right decision? A lot of times we make decisions based on external factors. It's easy when the vendor kills the thing and we just don't have a choice, or when the contract is out and we can't renew it, or we have to make an upgrade and it's going to stop working. And that's our time, because it's not our decision. We're not the bad guys. They're the bad guys. This factor here means that we have to change. Doing that means that you're letting the change happen on those terms, not on your own terms. So can you make this decision on your own terms and retire this thing? If not, what could go wrong? If you do, what could go wrong? Why are you retiring it? Is this a user-focused reason? Will people understand it? When we moved our email systems, we had folks who said, no, we need to go Office 365. That's what's best for us. But when we came back to our rationale, why we were retiring the old one and moving to the new one, the reasons that we moved to Gmail instead of Office 365, they're specific to Notre Dame, but they included the students and the faculty and the staff holistically to make the decision that we had to make. And even though retiring this and moving to where we went wasn't the right decision for every single individual person or every single individual department, it was the right thing for our entire university. When we could lay it out that way, even the people who wished we'd chosen another route understood why we were doing it and came to agree with the decision that, yes, this was the right thing for Notre Dame, even though this wasn't the thing that would have been best for our department. And we're going to have to work with that because we are here for the university's mission, not the other way around. What will replace it? Do you really understand all those reasons, all those ways it'll affect users? Do you have answers for those things? It's okay if sometimes the answer is you won't be able to do that. It's just not going to be an option. As long as that functional way, the goal that they are trying to achieve can be met another way. There are lots of ways to skin a cat, right? We just need to find the one that's going to meet your needs. That means getting away from the feature and more back to the purpose of using that. And then in the end, we celebrate this. We're going to drink some champagne. We're going to have a little bit of fun. I like the idea of throwing a retirement party, though I think our budgets might look a little funny if we bought, cases and cases of champagne. So maybe stick with the cake and punch. So with that, the slides here are at bit.ly/retire-service-webinar and bit.ly/retire-service-toolkit. You can find me there. You can email or tweet at me. And I know now we have Mitch has been hopefully taking questions. If you have questions, please post them in the chat window. Mitch, how's it going?
So, Chaz, Mitch has shared that his network is having a few issues.
Okay.
So we have a question from Todd Jensen, who says, is there a cost per user in any given service or service category that is determined as an industry average?
So not to my knowledge. I think it's because when you start to get to a standard like that, you start to talk about a commodity, right? If this is a thing that can be compared and that all things being equal, it's just this one or that one, it doesn't really matter, that's a commodity, right? And then you can start talking about an average cost like that. I think most of what we're dealing with these days is around differentiation. So there are lots of video conferencing services. There are lots of email platforms. There are lots of survey tools, you name it, right? Collaboration suites. Where what you start comparing against isn't apples to apples. There's always differentiation. And that's where you start to evaluate the value you get from this one at this cost versus that one at that cost, and whether or not it's really worth those differences. Because of that, it's one of the questions that came up in our workshop in Chicago was, okay, well, is there a number that you'd say like, okay, this is the usage number or this is the cost number that's like, now you can retire it. How do you know when that is? And I think it's subjective a little bit. It's based on the needs of your university. Frankly, in our organization, we have so many, and I know I'm not alone in this, but there's this sense of do more with less. which means that we have a ton of things that we want to get done, and it's a matter of prioritizing among those. So retiring a service is a project, and retiring the service offering is going to take a bunch of work depending on the offering. So how much investment is it worth? A couple of years ago, we had decided we wanted to completely retire that web publishing platform with the Tilde, and realized that even though the usage had dropped way off and the support was wonky, the cost of changing was actually more than the resources to change completely and migrate and shut it all the way down was more than it would be to just keep it alive in a deprecated minimal state on life support for a long time, because we can just do that. And then that lets us focus our energy on a higher profile, bigger impact things. So not a huge cost to it, but also not worth the investment to retire it.
Great. So Paul Shantz, and if I mispronounce anyone's name, my apologies, but Paul Shantz asks, to what extent do product focus groups inform key drivers for your users?
So I think in the process of talking through email, I personally talked to over 300 individuals. Some of that was through groups, focus groups, and department meetings, and others were individual interviews. I had the benefit of being in a role where my job was to go gather that information and digest it and try to represent all of those different opinions and thoughts and feelings and emotions, and then convey them back to people on the team. I really like the idea of getting those users together. I also really like the idea of keeping a mix of department or group focus groups versus individual interviews and weighing those against each other, because putting a group of people together and saying, can we shut this thing down? The answer is no. Putting a group of people together and asking carefully crafted questions and hoping that they don't all jump on top of each other's ideas to come up with a big consensus, that you get this groupthink approach that it can be dangerous. But you can also leverage all of that to get to new ideas that they might not have had, other thoughts. Somebody says something and it triggers something in somebody else. So that can be really useful. On the other hand, I like having those individual interviews because you can get a lot of that off the record or less formal setting to get their input. And then you can compare that with the big group. So if a big group has a very strong emotional reaction, but individually people aren't, that will tell you something as well.
Okay, we've answered all the questions that people put in the Q&A window. Chaz, if you want to close it out for us.
Okay. I guess, if you have any other questions, feel free to post them there. We're all so bad at shutting these things down because you are moving people's cheese. You're wrecking their lives. And in the case of email, we hit reset on 6 years worth of every single day, constant operational, functional expertise, right? I know how to do my job. I'm good at it. I'm efficient at it. I've got all the tricks, the shortcuts, the tools, everything is configured the way I like it. And then on June 17th, we hit reset and broke all that for them. And now they had to do something completely different. So it was going to be very painful. We knew that. And our job was to help them understand why we were making this change. So those drivers were so critical that they be user focused, because those people on that day are going to be cursing our names. We understand that. And we want them to at least be understanding of why this is happening and accepting of why it's happening. And then also the promise of what they're getting on the other side and helping connect the dots to those things. So you're going to get unlimited storage, and you're going to get this new functionality. You're going to be able to do all these other things, and helping them see those so that the pain is tempered with the benefit that comes from the other side. In a retirement process, we're thinking through, is this the right thing to do? Have we considered all of the angles? Am I confident? My mom retired a few years back and went through this process, and it was just really interesting to watch her agonize over this and then think about what that looks like, and then the transition, and months and months and months of planning just to get to the point where she could decide whether or not she was going to retire. Despite the part where she'd been planning this for a very long time, it was still a very difficult decision. And then the emotional reaction when she left, not just from her, leaving, but all of her coworkers and friends that she was leaving behind. It's a very emotional thing. And even though these are just bits and bytes and servers and hardware and software and networks, the services play a part in our lives, and it becomes an emotional thing. My email feels like a very personal thing. My website is a very personal thing. My video conferencing system that I use shouldn't feel so personal, but it is, because I use it. I understand it. We work together well, even though it's just technology. And so when some other organization, IT, is going to take it away, we have to remember that these are real people on the other side of that who are going to live and use this, and who are living with the technologies we provide, the services we provide, and the decisions that we make for them. So working with them, bringing them on board is all such a huge part. So like I say, with all of this, it's not so much the technology, it's the people, and working through that process.
Hey,
So,
hey, Chaz, Paul, I think I'm back. So sorry for the network troubles here. This is kind of a broad question. A lot of our members or our attendees are service management professionals. And if you did touch on this, forgive me, they were kind of cutting out because of my network problems. But can you talk to your experience, the integration with service management, like with the service owners, and how this retirement of these service offerings interplays with your service management practice? And again, it's a broad question, so just talk to your experience. So thanks.
Absolutely. We're in an interesting position. It's something we talked about a few months ago when we did the ITSM and product management constituent group panel webinar. The shift as more of our services are, the service offerings are becoming cloud offerings, and the way that we deliver the services tend to be less technology focused and more people change management. When you say change management, some folks hear, like an ITSM change management, and other people hear people change management, and both of them are critical, right? In how we deliver these. The way we retire these things needs that same care and approach. The challenge that I have seen a lot in our retirement is that a service owner often in the course of being good at delivering a service becomes personally invested in that service and the service offering success. And it can make it really hard to step back and think objectively about whether or not that's a thing you could retire. Identifying when something is ready to be retired is hard to do. It's something that needs that constant management. It's something that I think will always be a challenge for all of us. But what I'd hope is that we are focusing more on that user feedback and just in the service delivery overall, that the voices become louder, that we start to listen more carefully to when those things need to be retired, and that we're a little less personally invested in the solution and more invested in the delivery of a solution and meeting the user's needs. So let's try to be a little less married to our own products and more partnered with our users and making sure they're happy with that. I don't know if that answers your question, Mitch.
No, that's excellent. So again, so we've reached kind of at the end of our webinar. Thank you, Chaz, for presenting this information. This is very helpful. Just want to remind the audience that a recording will be available. And as Chaz mentioned, the links are available to the slide deck and the toolkit on the presentation here. He'll provide the Google link, and I'll make sure all that gets added to the wiki site. To review upcoming and past recordings, please visit our wiki site. If you just go to the Educause ITSM CG webpage, you can do a search for the wiki. And if you have any questions or have a topic you want to present on, always feel free to reach out to the group and send me an email. Thank you so much for presenting, Chaz. Thank you, everyone, for taking some time out today. And everyone have a good day.